The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on every spectator, every journalist, every attorney preparing for the proceedings. This was supposed to be just another routine hearing, a case of violent assault, an open and shut conviction. No one expected what was about to unfold. In the middle of the courtroom, seated behind the defense table, was Jamal Carter, a young black man in his late 20s. His wrists were shackled, the cold steel biting into his skin. His eyes, dull with exhaustion, remained lowered, as if he had already accepted his fate. The prosecution had painted him as a cold-blooded criminal, a man who had attacked an elderly woman, leaving her hospitalized and penniless. But Jamal had maintained his innocence from the beginning. In one of the courtroom's back rows, Monica Johnson sat with her 5-year-old son, Elijah. She wasn't here by choice. She had been called to testify, though she had nothing of value to offer. Her small grocery store was near the crime scene, and while she hadn't seen the attack itself, she had noticed something that night. At least that's what the lawyers believed. Elijah, unaware of the heavy atmosphere around him, played with a small toy car on the wooden bench. His tiny fingers guided it along the smooth surface, his lips parting slightly as he whispered quiet engine noises. His mother hushed him occasionally, but his attention remained fixed on the game he had created for himself. Then the side door of the courtroom swung open. A group of uniformed police officers entered, their boots clicking against the polished floor. They moved with authority, taking their places near the walls, their expressions unreadable. Among them was Sergeant Darius King, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding power. King was no ordinary officer. He was a man respected throughout the district, a cop who had built his reputation on being tough but fair. Some called him a hero, others whispered of his ruthless tactics, but no one could deny the influence he carried. As soon as King stepped inside, Elijah stopped moving. His small fingers went slack, and the toy car slipped from his grasp, landing on the floor with a dull clatter. His mother turned to him, startled, but Elijah's wide brown eyes were locked onto King. His little chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath hitching. The courtroom continued, lawyers speaking in sharp, confident tones, the judge preparing to proceed with testimonies. But Elijah was no longer a passive observer. In a voice that was clear and unwavering, he spoke. "I saw him." A sharp silence cut through the room. Monica stiffened, heads turned, journalists exchanged glances, their pens hesitating over their notepads. The judge, taken aback, glanced toward the child. Elijah lifted his small hand, his finger rising slowly directly toward Sergeant King. He was there. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For the first time that day, Jamal Carter lifted his head. The moment that followed felt endless. King's expression didn't change, but those watching closely saw it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the shift in his stance. The air was no longer tense. It was electric. And in that instant, everyone knew this case was about to take a turn no one had expected. The courtroom buzzed with an almost suffocating tension, a silent weight pressing down on everyone inside. The air was thick with expectation, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Every seat in the gallery was filled, journalists gripping their notepads, spectators whispering among themselves, and legal observers quietly analyzing every move. The case had drawn massive public attention, and today's hearing was supposed to be just another step toward a swift conviction. Sunlight streamed through the towering courtroom windows, streaking across the polished wooden floor in golden slashes. The old ceiling fans hummed faintly above, doing little to break the heavy atmosphere. Every sound, the rustling of papers, the tapping of a pen, the faint creak of the judge's chair, felt amplified, like the room itself was holding its breath. At the center of it all sat Jamal Carter, the accused. He was shackled at the wrists, his shoulders slightly hunched as he sat motionless behind the defense table. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on his face, emphasizing the deep shadows under his tired eyes. He barely looked up, as if the weight of the entire trial had already crushed whatever hope he had left. His silence was not guilt, it was exhaustion. But to the public, to the prosecution, he was already guilty. On the other side of the room, Eric Calloway, the lead prosecutor, stood with an air of complete control. His tailored navy blue suit was crisp, his every movement calculated. He was a man who didn't lose. In this case, this was just another easy victory. He adjusted his tie and glanced toward the jury box, his confidence unshaken. To him, Jamal Carter was a textbook criminal. A violent offender who had attacked an elderly woman, leaving her bruised, broken, and terrified. The evidence was stacked high: security footage, witness statements, a narrative that fit too perfectly. A black man from the wrong neighborhood. No financial backing, no influential connections. No one powerful enough to stand up for him. Calloway had built his career on cases like this, on criminals who had no way out. The law was on his side, the system was on his side, the jury, he was sure, would be on his side too. Across from him, Jamal's defense attorney, Peter Lawson, was the complete opposite. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his expression tense. He wasn't incompetent, he just didn't have the resources, the power, or the backing of a high-profile firm. He was overworked, underfunded, and fighting an uphill battle. But even he knew this case had already been decided before it even began. The room stirred as the judge cleared his throat, preparing to begin. And then the side door creaked open. A group of uniformed officers entered, their black boots thudding against the floor as they took their positions. The movement was routine, just protocol to maintain order. But then he walked in. Sergeant Darius King, a towering figure built like a soldier with an undeniable presence. He didn't need to speak to command authority. His reputation did that for him. Some saw him as a guardian of the law, a man who had cleaned up the streets. Others knew better. He took his place along the side of the courtroom, his face unreadable. And then something happened that no one expected. A small clatter broke the silence. A tiny toy car fell from a child's hands, hitting the wooden floor and rolling under the bench. It wasn't much, just a small noise, but it was enough. Enough to break the rhythm of the courtroom, enough to pull attention away from the case, enough to make people notice the little boy, Elijah. His hands were stiff, his chest rose and fell quickly. And then he spoke. I saw him. The entire courtroom froze. Eyes turned toward the child. The judge, the defense attorney, the jury, even Calloway. Elijah's small hand lifted, and with a steady, unshaken finger, he pointed directly at Sergeant King. He was there. Gasps rippled through the room. The atmosphere, once tense, was now electric. For the first time since the trial began, Calloway looked uncertain. For the first time that day, Jamal Carter lifted his head. And for the first time in his entire career, Sergeant Darius King took a small, almost imperceptible step back. Monica Johnson sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench near the back of the courtroom, her fingers gripping the fabric of her skirt. She didn't want to be here. In fact, she had considered not coming at all, but the subpoena had left her no choice. She was just a store owner, a single mother trying to raise her son in a world that never made things easy. She hadn't witnessed the crime. She hadn't seen the attack. All she had seen were shadows. A flicker of movement near her grocery store that night. A dark car idling by the alley. Nothing concrete. Nothing that should have mattered. And yet, they had called her to testify. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightness in her chest. Beside her, Elijah, her 5-year-old son, sat with his legs swinging back and forth. His small fingers gripped a blue toy car, running it along the smooth wooden surface of the bench. He was too young to understand why they were here, too young to feel the weight of the case pressing down on everyone else in the room. His world was still simple, innocent. He hummed quietly, guiding his toy car up an invisible ramp, whispering the soft sound of an engine revving. Vroom, vroom. Monica glanced at him, her heart aching. If only he could stay this carefree forever. She placed a gentle hand on his knee. "Elijah, baby, keep it down," she murmured. He looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes before nodding, pulling the toy closer to his chest. The courtroom was too tense, too silent, for the sound of a child playing. Every person here was focused on one thing: getting a conviction. Monica had seen the headlines. The media had already decided Jamal Carter was guilty. A violent man, a criminal, a danger to society. She wasn't sure what to believe. She had never met Jamal before today, but something about the way he sat, shackled and silent, made her uneasy. He looked like a man who had already lost everything. Her gaze shifted to the prosecution's table, where Eric Calloway, the lead prosecutor, stood with quiet confidence. He had already won this case in his mind. The defense attorney, on the other hand, Peter Lawson, looked tired, overworked, underfunded. It didn't take much to see how this would play out. Elijah squirmed beside her, rolling his toy car between his palms, clearly restless. The heavy, serious air of the courtroom didn't suit him. His world was supposed to be filled with cartoons and playgrounds, not cold legal battles and accusations. Then, the side door creaked open. Monica barely reacted at first until she saw the shift in her son. A group of uniformed officers walked in, their polished boots striking the wooden floor in unison. Their presence was procedural, just there to maintain order. But one man stood out from the rest: Sergeant Darius King. Tall, broad-shouldered, a name that carried weight in this city. Monica had heard of him. Everyone had. A man of authority, a man of the law, a man people either respected or feared. She didn't expect Elijah to react. He didn't know who Sergeant King was. But the moment King stepped into the room, Elijah's fingers went rigid. His toy car, which had been rolling smoothly along the bench, slipped from his grasp and landed on the floor with a soft clatter. Monica turned to him, frowning. "Elijah?" But he didn't respond. His small hands clenched, his breath quickened, and his wide brown eyes locked onto Sergeant King. Something was wrong. The courtroom moved on, lawyers speaking, the judge preparing to proceed. But Elijah was frozen. And then, in a voice that was clear and unwavering, he said it. "I saw him." Monica's heart stopped. She felt every muscle in her body tense, her mind racing to process the words. Saw who? Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the spectators. Even the judge, who had been preparing to begin, looked up. Elijah's small hand lifted, and with a steady, unshaken finger, he pointed directly at Sergeant King. He was there. Gasps spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Monica grabbed her son's hand, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Elijah, baby, what are you talking about?" But he didn't waver. His eyes, still fixed on Sergeant King, held no fear, no hesitation. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, for the first time, King moved. It was small, barely noticeable, but Monica saw it. A single step, a slow, deliberate shift backward. Not toward the boy. Not toward the people staring at him, but away. As if for the first time in his life, Sergeant Darius King was the one caught off guard. The heavy wooden side door creaked open, drawing the attention of several courtroom spectators. A group of uniformed police officers entered in a quiet but disciplined formation, their boots striking the floor in unison. No, they moved with a certain purpose. Not hurried, not slow, just controlled. Their presence was routine, just another layer of security for a case that had already drawn significant public attention. Nothing unusual. And yet the atmosphere shifted. Among the officers was Sergeant Darius King. His presence was impossible to ignore. Standing over 6 feet tall, his broad frame filled the space effortlessly. His uniform, crisp and immaculate, carried the weight of authority. Even without speaking, he exuded control. His movements were deliberate, calculated. the kind of man who commanded respect without ever needing to ask for it. For years, King had been a pillar of law enforcement, a man whose name carried both admiration and fear. To the public, he was the protector of the city, the one who kept the streets clean. To criminals, he was a hunter, a man with a reputation for getting the job done by any means necessary. To fellow officers, he was untouchable. But in this moment, something unexpected happened. Seated at the back of the courtroom, Elijah Johnson stopped moving. The 5-year-old's tiny hands, which had been restlessly rolling his toy car back and forth along the bench, suddenly froze. His fingers slackened, and the little car slipped from his grasp. It tumbled off the edge of the bench, landing on the wooden floor with a dull clatter. The sound was small, almost insignificant, yet somehow it cut through the noise of the entire courtroom. Monica turned toward her son, puzzled. "Elijah?" But he didn't respond. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His wide brown eyes were locked onto Sergeant King. Something about the officer's presence had unraveled the boy's entire world. Monica followed her son's gaze, confusion tightening in her chest. Why was Elijah staring at him like that? The courtroom continued around them, lawyers flipping through files, the judge preparing to begin, the prosecutor adjusting his suit. No one had noticed yet. But then Elijah spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw him." The words hung in the air like a blade. Monica's heart skipped a beat. The courtroom froze. Journalists paused mid-sentence, their pens hovering over their notepads. Spectators stopped whispering, their heads snapping toward the child. Even the judge, who had just lifted his gavel, lowered it slowly, his gaze shifting toward the small voice that had shattered the courtroom's rhythm. Monica turned sharply to her son, her fingers tightening around his little hand. "Elijah!" But before she could say anything, his hand lifted. Tiny fingers, small but sure, rose and pointed directly at Sergeant King. He was there. A slow, creeping silence spread through the room. For the first time that day, Jamal Carter lifted his head. His dull, exhausted eyes locked onto the man Elijah was pointing at. The defense attorney, Peter Lawson, who had been flipping through his notes, froze mid-motion, his fingers hovering over the page. The lead prosecutor, Eric Calloway, who had entered the courtroom with absolute confidence, stiffened. The courtroom had already been filled with tension, but now it was electric. All eyes turned to Sergeant King, the man of authority, the man of power, the man who never flinched. And yet, for the first time, he did. It was small, barely noticeable, but Monica saw it. A slight tightening of his jaw, a minuscule shift in his posture, a flicker of something in his eyes. And then he stepped back. It wasn't much, just half a step, maybe even less, but he moved, and that was enough. Enough for those who were watching him closely. Enough for Monica's stomach to drop in dread. Enough to send a chill through the room. This was not the reaction of an innocent man. This was something else entirely. For the first time in his entire career, Sergeant Darius King was on the other side of an accusation. And in that moment, as the silence stretched unbearably, the entire courtroom realized one thing. Elijah Johnson had just changed everything. For a moment, time stood still. The courtroom, once filled with murmured conversations and the rustling of papers, had fallen into absolute silence. Everyone had heard it. A 5-year-old boy had just pointed at a decorated police officer, a man seen as a pillar of justice, and said the words that no one expected. "I saw him." The judge, halfway through adjusting his glasses, froze. The defense attorney's pen hovered over his notepad, completely still. The prosecutor, Eric Calloway, who had entered this courtroom with nothing but certainty, now flipped through his notes, as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. Seated at the defendant's table, Jamal Carter's head lifted, his dull, defeated eyes suddenly alive with something new. Hope? Confusion? Shock? Even he wasn't sure. And then Elijah's small hand rose again. His tiny finger pointed directly at Sergeant Darius King. He was there. A ripple of gasps spread across the room like a shockwave. Sergeant King remained still, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. But for those watching closely, for those who understood body language, they saw it. The slightest clench of his jaw, a barely noticeable shift of his stance. Monica felt her breath catch in her throat. Her fingers instinctively tightened around Elijah's arm, as if she could somehow pull him back from the words he had already spoken. The judge, his voice measured but edged with something unreadable, spoke first. "Elijah," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You say you saw Sergeant King? Where?" Elijah's eyes didn't move away. They remained locked onto King, unblinking. "That night," Elijah whispered, "by the store." The reaction was immediate. The defense attorney, Peter Lawson, straightened in his seat. His face, once tired and resigned, was now filled with a sharp, sudden intensity. Calloway, the prosecutor who had never been rattled before, ran a hand down his tie, clearing his throat. He hesitated. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The judge ignored him. "Elijah," the judge said again gently now, "tell me exactly what you saw." Elijah took a shaky breath. His small hands trembled slightly in Monica's grasp, but when he spoke, his words were clear. "I saw a car," he said. "A black one. It was parked near the alley. I saw him get out." Sergeant King didn't move, but Monica did. Her entire body went cold. She remembered that night. She hadn't seen much, just a glimpse. A dark car, a shadow by the alley near her store. She had barely thought about it then. It hadn't seemed important. But Elijah had seen more. The weight of her son's words pressed down on her like a boulder. Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor, this is coming from a child, a 5-year-old child. We cannot possibly take this as reliable testimony." The defense attorney's voice was sharp. "Why not? Because it doesn't fit into your neat little conviction package?" Calloway shot him a glare. "It's because a child's memory is impressionable. There's no way to prove this." The judge turned back to Elijah. "Did you see him do anything?" Elijah's brow furrowed, as if he was thinking hard. "He talked to someone." The air in the room grew heavier. Elijah hesitated. Then he left. The silence stretched too long. Finally, Calloway spoke, his voice tight. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss." Then Sergeant King moved. It was small, but Monica saw it. A step back. Not toward the child, not toward the jury, but away. Away from the words, away from the truth. The defense attorney pounced on it. "Your Honor, I request a recess to review this testimony further." The prosecutor interrupted. "This is absurd. A child's word." But the judge wasn't looking at Calloway anymore. He was looking at King. And King wouldn't meet his eyes. The pause stretched. Then, the judge slammed his gavel. "We will take a recess," he announced. 10 minutes. The room erupted. Journalists scrambled, flipping pages, whispering hurriedly to each other. Spectators gasped, some already reaching for their phones. The energy in the courtroom had shifted entirely, from an inevitable conviction to something else entirely. Something no one had expected. As people began to move, Monica turned quickly to her son. She crouched down in front of him, brushing a hand over his forehead. "Elijah, baby," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Elijah blinked up at her, his small fingers gripping her sleeve. His voice was soft but unwavering. "I remember his face." A chill ran down Monica's spine. She swallowed, then stood up, heart pounding. She turned, her eyes immediately landing on Sergeant King. He was staring at her now. Not at Elijah, at her. And in his eyes, for the first time that day, Monica saw something that terrified her more than anything else. A warning. She reached down, gripping Elijah's hand as tightly as she could. Because whatever they had just uncovered, it was bigger than they ever could have imagined. Monica pulled Elijah toward a quieter corner of the courtroom as the spectators and attorneys scattered for recess. The room still buzzed with frantic whispers, but she could barely hear them over the pounding in her chest. She crouched down to his level, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. His little face was calm, but his fingers twitched against the fabric of her sleeve. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Baby, what did you see?" His big brown eyes blinked up at her, filled with nothing but certainty. He was at the alley that night. Monica felt her stomach drop. The words hit her like a hammer. She had hoped, prayed, that maybe he was mistaken. Maybe it was a trick of his memory. But deep down, she already knew the truth. Her mind reeled. Sergeant Darius King at the alley that night. "Elijah," she swallowed hard, lowering her voice even further. "Are you sure, baby? Are you absolutely sure?" He nodded, no hesitation. "I remember his face," he said again, just as he had in the courtroom. He was standing by a car, a black one. He talked to someone, then drove away. Monica's breath hitched. A black car, a shadow near the alley, a lingering feeling that something had been off that night, but she had pushed it aside. And now, her son had seen it all. A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Miss Johnson." She turned sharply. The prosecutor, Eric Calloway, stood just a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes unreadable. He had been watching them. Monica tensed. She had never trusted prosecutors. To her, they were just men in expensive suits, eager to build their careers by sending people like Jamal Carter to prison. But right now, Calloway didn't look like a man who had everything under control anymore. Right now, he looked worried. "I need to speak with you," he said, privately. Monica hesitated. "Why?" Calloway glanced around before lowering his voice. "Because if what your son just said is true, we have a much bigger problem than this case." Monica's hands instinctively tightened around Elijah's shoulders. "I'm not leaving my son," she said firmly. Calloway nodded. "Fine, but I need you to come with me, now." Minutes later, Monica found herself in a small, windowless office inside the courthouse. A single overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the room. A computer monitor sat on the desk, and a young legal assistant was typing furiously, her brows furrowed in concentration. "We pulled security footage from the street near Miss Johnson's store," the assistant said without looking up. "It's grainy, but—" She trailed off, exhaling. "You need to see this." Calloway motioned toward the screen. "Roll it back to the night of the incident." The assistant clicked through the footage. Monica's pulse thundered in her ears as the black and white video flickered to life. At first there was nothing, just an empty street, a few cars passing by, the glow of a street lamp flickering. Then a black car rolled into frame. Monica's stomach tightened. Elijah's grip on her hand tightened too. "There," the assistant muttered, pausing the footage. "That's the vehicle." Calloway leaned in. "Zoom in on the driver." The video was blurry, the details hard to make out. But as the assistant enhanced the image, a shadowy figure came into view. Monica's breath caught in her throat. The broad shoulders, the stiff posture, the way the man moved as he stepped out of the car. It was him. Even through the grainy distortion, even in the low-quality security feed, it was him. "Sergeant Darius King." A sharp silence settled in the room. The weight of what they had just seen pressed down on Monica like a suffocating fog. Elijah had been right. King had been there that night. And if he had been there, what else was he hiding? Calloway let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing against the desk. "This changes everything." Monica barely heard him. Her mind was racing. Her son, her 5-year-old baby, had just exposed something far bigger than she ever imagined. Her heart pounded as she turned back to Calloway. "What does this mean?" The prosecutor's expression was grim. "It means," he said carefully, "that we're not just dealing with a wrongful conviction." His gaze flickered toward the frozen image on the screen. It means we might be dealing with a dirty cop. The room felt colder now. Monica wrapped an arm around Elijah, holding him close. She had stepped into this courthouse thinking this was just another case, another black man railroaded by the system. But now, this wasn't just about Jamal Carter anymore. This was about power, corruption, and the kind of people who would do anything to protect themselves. Monica looked at Calloway. "What are you going to do?" He hesitated. "I need to verify this, get more footage, cross-check King's records." His eyes met hers. "But if this is real, if he was there that night, this entire case could unravel." Monica's blood ran cold. "And what happens if he finds out we know?" she whispered. The silence stretched too long. Finally, Calloway spoke. His voice was low. "Careful. You need to be careful, Miss Johnson." Monica's grip on Elijah tightened, because deep down she already knew what he wasn't saying out loud. If King had something to hide, they were in danger now. The room felt like it had lost all air. The frozen, grainy image on the screen showed exactly what they had feared. Sergeant Darius King standing next to a black car near the crime scene. It was him. Undeniably him. The legal assistant swallowed hard. "We enhanced it as much as we could." She turned to Calloway, her voice tight. "It's King!" Calloway's jaw clenched. He was never the type to show panic, but right now, he was close. He reached for his phone. "I need access to his past cases. Everything he's worked on." The assistant nodded and immediately started typing. Monica barely noticed them. She was still staring at the screen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Elijah had seen it first. A 5-year-old had put the pieces together before any of them. She squeezed his small hand, pulling him closer. Elijah had just exposed something far bigger than she could have imagined. A pattern emerges. Minutes passed in a blur as the legal team dug deeper. Then they found it. One case, then another, then another. Each file told the same story. A black man accused of a crime. Key evidence appearing conveniently. Crucial witnesses disappearing. The more they looked, the worse it got. King had been involved in dozens of cases where convictions were handed down too easily. This wasn't just one corrupt cop. This was a system, a machine designed to frame innocent men and make sure they never walked free. Monica felt sick. Her hands shook as she turned to Calloway. "How long has this been going on?" He exhaled slowly. "Years." He turned back to the assistant. "Pull every case he's touched. Find out if any evidence was tampered with." She nodded and kept working. Monica wrapped her arms protectively around Elijah. He had no idea what he had just uncovered. Did King vanishes? Calloway's phone buzzed. He answered immediately. "What do you mean he's gone?" he snapped. Monica's stomach dropped. She turned sharply toward him. "What happened?" Calloway's face was grim. "King left the courthouse 20 minutes ago," he said. "No one's been able to reach him since." Monica felt a cold chill creep down her spine. King had never lost control before. But now he knew the truth was closing in. And he was already moving. Monica gripped Elijah tighter. "What does that mean?" Calloway hesitated. Then carefully he said, "It means if he knows we're onto him, you and your son aren't safe." A mother's fear. The words hit Monica like a hammer. "Not safe." She stared at the prosecutor. "You said that like a warning." Calloway didn't blink. "Because it is." Her pulse raced. Elijah, her baby, was now in the center of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She turned toward the door instinctively. "I need to get my son out of here." Calloway placed a firm hand on her arm. "We're placing officers outside your house. You won't be alone." It wasn't enough. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to grab Elijah and never look back. Because if King was capable of framing innocent men, what else was he capable of? The watcher in the dark. That night, Monica couldn't sleep. 2 uniformed officers sat outside her house in a squad car. The prosecutor had promised she would be safe. But still, Something felt off. She kept Elijah close, her arm wrapped around him as he slept. His small fingers clutched her shirt, his breathing slow and steady. Her baby, the little boy who had unknowingly shattered the lies of a powerful man. A noise outside. Monica's eyes snapped open. Her body went still, her breath caught in her throat. She listened. The officers were still outside. She could see the faint glow of their patrol car's headlights through the window. But there was something else. A presence. Watching. She slid out of bed as quietly as possible, moving toward the window. And then, she saw it. A dark silhouette, standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. He was watching. Her entire body went ice cold. She reached for her phone with shaking hands. Before she could dial, the figure stepped back into the darkness and vanished. Monica couldn't breathe. She knew. She knew exactly who it was. King was already here. And this wasn't over? Not even close.